The first call came in at 6:47 in the morning. A woman's voice, thin and reedy with terror, crackling over the 911 line. Her name was Helen Gable. She was the landlady of a shabby two-story apartment complex called the Sagebrush Arms, a collection of stucco boxes baking under the relentless sun of Red Rock, Nevada. She was crying so hard the dispatcher could barely understand her. "They're dead," she kept repeating. "Oh God, the girls are dead." When sheriff's deputies kicked in the door to apartment 2B, the heat hit them first. Stale, trapped air, thick with the coppery sweet smell of blood. It was a smell that clung to the back of your throat, a taste of violence. The scene inside was a tableau from a slaughterhouse. Blood was everywhere. It had soaked into the cheap beige carpet, turning it a dark, ugly crimson. It was pooled on the floor in glistening slicks. It was splattered across the thin drywall, streaked on the pillows, and soaked into the blankets on the two mattresses that lay on the floor. At first glance, it looked like two victims. But as the deputies' eyes adjusted to the grim reality of the room, they saw the third, 3 young women, their lives extinguished in a frenzy of brutal, intimate violence. A forensics team, their faces grim and set, later determined that all 3 had been stabbed multiple times. The chest, the abdomen, a sharp object used with savage force. They had bled to death slowly. Sometime between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, the victims were identified quickly. The primary tenant of the room, a young woman who had been renting for less than a month, was 20-year-old Leah Sharp. Her 16-year-old sister, Chloe, was the second victim. The third was Leah's best friend, Madison Maddie Hayes, also 20. All 3 were local girls, born and raised in the dusty, unforgiving landscape of Red Rock. The first officer on the scene had the heartbreaking task of calling their mother. Mrs. Sharp's wail of grief when she heard the news was a sound that would echo in the halls of the sheriff's department for years to come. A sound of a soul being ripped in two. A mother's worst nightmare, delivered over a crackling phone line in the sterile light of a new day. The investigation began in the blood-soaked room. It was a chaotic scene. The drawers of a cheap dresser were pulled out. Their contents spilled onto the floor. Clothes were strewn about. It looked like a robbery, but it felt wrong. The most valuable items were untouched. 3 smartphones lay on a small end table. Handbags, backpacks, and wallets were all present, their cash and cards still inside. Robbery wasn't the motive. The girls' clothing was intact, their bodies positioned in a way that suggested they hadn't been sexually assaulted. That motive was ruled out too. This was something else. Something personal, something born of rage. Chloe, the youngest, had defensive wounds. Deep cuts on her arm and the palm of her hand, the kind a person gets when they grab the blade of a knife in a desperate struggle for their life. Leah and Maddie had been bound, their wrists and ankles tied tightly with strips of torn bedsheets. But the most important clue was not on the victims, it was on the floor. Amidst the carnage, the crime scene investigators found numerous small, bloody footprints. They weren't from the victims, they were from a man's shoe. A size 9. The prints led from the center of the room, out the door, down the metal staircase of the apartment complex, across the dusty courtyard, and out the main gate. They continued for another 50 yards down the street before they vanished. And the blood that made the prints wasn't the victim's blood. Lab tests would later confirm it. The blood belonged to the killer. He had been injured badly in the struggle. Chloe had fought back. She had wounded her attacker before he killed her. The timeline started to form. Mrs. Gable, the landlady, told detectives she had been woken up around 2 in the morning by a loud argument. It was coming from Leah's room. She heard angry voices, both male and female. She distinctly remembered hearing Leah's voice. It was, in Mrs. Gable's words, very harsh. Another tenant, a man named Mr. Rossi, who lived in the unit below, confirmed her story. The shouting had woken him up too. It was loud, furious. This told the police one crucial thing: the killer was likely known to the victims. There were no signs of forced entry. They had let him in. The argument suggested a relationship, a conflict that had spiraled into unimaginable violence. The social lives of the victims, particularly Leah's, were a tangled web. They were young, they were fun-loving, and they had a wide circle of friends, many of them male. The detective's first stop was a local bar, the Rattlesnake Lounge, a dive on the edge of town where Maddie's older sister Jenna worked as a bartender. Jenna, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen from crying, said the three girls had been at the bar on the night of June 22nd, 2 nights before the murder. They were drinking, laughing, having a good time. They left around 1 in the morning, she said. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but another employee, a bouncer, told a different story. The girls hadn't been alone. They were drinking with a man. He'd paid for their drinks, a round of tequila shots. The bouncer remembered them leaving together after 1 when a sudden desert thunderstorm had rolled in, unleashing a downpour. He couldn't remember the man's face. The lighting in the Rattlesnake was deliberately dim, and the place had been packed. He was just another face in the crowd. The detectives pulled security footage from a gas station across the street from the apartment complex. At 2:14 a.m. on the morning of June 23rd, they saw them, Leah, Chloe, and Maddie, walking together, huddled under a shared jacket to shield themselves from the lingering rain. They turned into the dark alley that led to the courtyard of the Sagebrush Arms. A few dozen seconds later, a man's figure appears on the same footage. He follows them into the alley. The DNA from the blood at the scene gave them a profile. It belonged to an unknown male, the killer. Now they had a face, however grainy, to go with it. An intense, painstaking investigation began. They tracked down everyone who had been at the bar that night. They finally identified the man who had been drinking with the girls. His name was Kyle. They brought him in for questioning. He was a young construction worker, nervous and sweating under the harsh lights of the interrogation room. He admitted he had been with them. He said Leah had approached him, started a conversation. He bought them a round of drinks. He claimed he offered to give them a ride home, but they said they wanted to walk around, to enjoy the cool air after the rain. He said he caught a cab home by himself around 1:30. It was a good story, but they had heard better. They checked his alibi. The taxi driver confirmed Kyle's story. Security footage from his own apartment building showed him entering at 1:45 a.m. and not leaving again until 10 the next morning. Kyle was not their man. The investigation pivoted. Leah's father, a broken man who seemed to have aged a decade in a day, gave them a new name, a man named Mark. He was Leah's boyfriend, or more accurately, her ex-boyfriend. Mark was in his late 30s, and until recently he had been married. He had divorced his wife for Leah. The relationship, her father said, had been a storm. They fought constantly. The main source of conflict was money. Leah, it seemed, had been more interested in Mark's wallet than his heart. When he divorced his wife, his finances took a major hit. He wasn't spending as lavishly on Leah anymore, and she had started to pull away. Phone records showed that Mark was the last person to contact Leah before she died. He had called and texted her repeatedly around 1 in the morning on the night of the murders. He was also the first person to arrive at the crime scene, even before the police. He had been out of town visiting his parents. When he couldn't get a hold of Leah or Chloe or Maddie, he got a bad feeling and drove all night to get back to Red Rock. He claimed he found the apartment door unlocked, saw the blood and then the bodies. He was the perfect suspect. He had motive, means, and opportunity. He was a man scorned with a history of jealousy and rage. The detectives were sure they had their killer. They took his DNA. They waited for the lab results, confident they would get a match. The call from the lab came 2 days later. Mark's DNA did not match the killer's DNA found at the scene. He was not the man who had left the bloody footprints. They investigated the possibility that he had hired a hitman, but found no evidence, no strange financial transactions, no suspicious phone calls. Mark was another dead end. The case was going cold. The leads had dried up. All they had was the grainy footage of the man following the girls into the alley and the knowledge that he was out there, somewhere, with a badly wounded arm or hand. The investigation refocused on that single, crucial fact. They analyzed the security footage again, this time from every camera within a 10-block radius of the crime scene. And they found him. At 5 a.m., nearly 3 hours after the murders, a camera mounted on a warehouse a few blocks away captured a man emerging from an alley connected to the apartment complex. He was walking with a strange, tired gait, and he was holding his right hand tightly against his chest as if trying to staunch a deep bleeding wound. The killer was severely injured, his right hand or his right forearm. This was the break they needed. Sheriff Brody launched a massive citywide search. His deputies checked the records of every taxi company, looking for fares picked up in that area around that time. They visited every hospital, every urgent care clinic, every back alley doctor, looking for a man who had been treated for a knife wound to his right hand on the morning of June 23rd. For 5 days, they found nothing. The trail was ice cold. The city was on edge. The brutal triple murder was all anyone could talk about. Fear, thick and suffocating, had settled over Red Rock. Then on June 28th, they got a hit. A clerk at a small county health clinic on the other side of town remembered something. At 7 a.m. on the morning of the 23rd, a man had come in with a nasty cut on his right hand. He claimed he had gotten drunk, fallen, and cut himself on a broken bottle. The nurse bandaged the wound. The man seemed agitated, jumpy. Before they could complete his discharge paperwork, he had simply walked out. The name he had given was Wyatt Gage. The security camera in the clinic's waiting room had gotten a clear shot of his face. The detectives had their man. They ran his name. He had a minor record, a drunken disorderly from a few years back. They had an address. They found Wyatt Gage in a small, cluttered room he rented in a boarding house. He was there, his right hand heavily bandaged. In his closet, they found a pair of cheap leather shoes. The sole pattern was a perfect match for the bloody prints at the crime scene. They took him into custody. The DNA comparison was rushed through the lab. It was a perfect match. Wyatt Gage's blood was the blood that had been found all over the apartment where Leah, Chloe, and Maddie had died. He was arrested. In the sterile, cold environment of the interrogation room, under the relentless buzzing of the fluorescent lights, he confessed. Wyatt Gage's story began not with malice, but with grief and alcohol. On the evening of June 22nd, his grandmother had been admitted to the hospital. Her heart was failing. He knew she didn't have long. Distraught, he met up with a few friends and started drinking. Hard. He drank until the world became a blurry, meaningless smear. Sometime around midnight, he found himself on the stone steps of the old, boarded-up courthouse downtown. He sat down. He passed out. He awoke to a sharp, sudden pain. A bottle had struck him on the side of the head. He sat up, his head throbbing, a trickle of blood running down his temple. He saw them, 3 girls standing a few feet away, laughing. It was Leah, Chloe, and Maddie. He staggered to his feet, his mind a fog of alcohol and rage. He accused them of throwing the bottle. A heated argument erupted right there on the deserted street. Wyatt claimed they were reckless, that they hadn't even apologized. The girls, full of the defiant bravado of youth and their own share of alcohol, fired back. They said they had been throwing a bag of trash into a nearby bin and a bottle had fallen out. They told him he shouldn't be passed out drunk in a public place anyway. They were dismissive, contemptuous. That contempt lit a fuse in Wyatt Gage. He felt humiliated, disrespected. As they walked away, still laughing, he decided he wasn't going to let it go. He followed them. He kept his distance, lurking in the shadows, his mind churning with a toxic brew of self-pity and fury. He watched them turn into the alley. He followed them into the courtyard. He followed them right up the stairs to their apartment. He pushed the unlocked door open and stepped inside. He demanded an apology. This was the argument the landlady and the neighbor had heard. The shouting match. Wyatt said the girls didn't just refuse to apologize. They swore at him. They pushed him, trying to get him out of the room. "Get the hell out of here, you creep!" Leah had screamed, her voice, as the landlady had noted, harsh and cutting. In that moment, something in Wyatt Gage broke. He saw a fruit knife about 8 inches long lying on a small kitchen counter. He grabbed it. He didn't intend to kill them, he claimed. He just wanted to scare them, to regain control, to make them listen. He ordered them to tie each other up with strips torn from the bed sheets. He sat there for a while, the knife in his hand, his head swimming with booze and adrenaline. He was so intoxicated that he dozed off, just for a moment, his head slumping forward. That's when Chloe made her move. She had managed to work one hand free. She saw the knife, saw Wyatt slumped in the chair. She lunged for the weapon. They struggled. Chloe, small but fierce, fought for her life. During the chaotic, desperate tussle, she managed to stab Wyatt deep in his right arm. The sharp, searing pain cut through his drunken haze. It was replaced by a pure, white-hot rage. He wrestled the knife back from her, and then he snapped. He stabbed her. Again and again, a frenzy of violence. He didn't stop until she was limp and lifeless on the floor. He then turned to the other two girls, who were bound and screaming in terror. In a blind, uncontrollable fury, fueled by his own pain and the sight of his own blood, he killed them too. He told the detectives he regretted it the moment it was over. The rage subsided, leaving a hollow, sickening emptiness. He denied robbing them or rummaging through their things. The mess in the room, he said, was from when he had forced the girls to tear the place apart, looking for ropes to tie themselves up. After the murders, he tore a piece from one of the victims' shirts and wrapped it around his bleeding arm. He slipped out of the apartment complex through a back exit and vanished into the night. His confession was corroborated by the evidence. The injury on his head was consistent with being hit by a glass bottle. The testimony of the neighbors about the loud argument confirmed his story of the initial confrontation. The deep wound on his arm was the wound Chloe had given him. The case of Wyatt Gage became a dark cautionary tale in Red Rock. It was a story about how quickly a minor conflict could escalate into an unimaginable tragedy. The local news and talk shows were filled with analysis. They talked about the triggering factor. Wyatt Gage, drunk and grieving, was a powder keg. The girls, with their own reckless and defiant attitude, had provided the spark. His decision to follow them home was not a spontaneous act of rage. It was a planned confrontation, a deliberate choice to nurse his wounded pride. When they continued to insult and challenge him in their own home, his anger morphed into a burning hatred. His intention shifted from seeking an apology to inflicting punishment, but the critical turning point, the moment the situation spiraled from a terrifying home invasion into a triple homicide, was Chloe's desperate act of defiance. By untying herself and trying to grab the knife, she had sealed her own fate, and the fates of her sister and her friend. It was a brave act, but it was also, as one retired detective commented on a local news program, a fatal miscalculation. The victims had so many chances to de-escalate the situation, a simple apology on the street, recognizing the inherent danger of a drunk, angry man and walking away, calling the police when they realized he had followed them home instead of trying to confront him themselves. They had, as the prosecutor would later argue in court, disregarded and challenged the killer instead of appeasing him to protect their lives. They showed a fatal lack of understanding of the kind of danger they were in. The tragedy was not just caused by the killer's knife, but also, in a way, by their own words, their own pride. A tragic cocktail of misjudgment, bravado, and bad luck. Wyatt Gage's background painted a picture of a man living under immense pressure. He was, as a friend described him, a strange guy. Introverted, but with a grumpy and extreme side. He came from a poor family. He was the only son with elderly, ailing parents. His mother had a mild intellectual disability, and his father was too sick to work. After high school, Wyatt became the sole provider for the family. The weight of that responsibility was a constant, crushing burden. His parents, when interviewed, couldn't believe their quiet, burdened son was capable of such a monstrous act. In court, Wyatt Gage expressed deep remorse. He cried for his parents, for the shame and grief he had brought upon them, but he had none left for his victims. In November of 2012, after a short trial, Wyatt Gage was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The verdict brought a grim sense of closure to the city of Red Rock, but it did little to erase the horror of what had happened in that small, blood-soaked apartment, a place where a thrown bottle and a few harsh words had become the prelude to a symphony of death.